There are billions of people in the world today who are technically not living in poverty, but we can't say they're thriving. We can't say they're resilient. In fact, I'll share some of the, COVID, the way COVID has impacted many people, right? So thank you for that, right? What we will be talking about today, and a lot of what my work is about, is on prosperity, because ending poverty is not enough. We really have to think about how do we create prosperity, resilience, a lot of abundance, a lot of these words that you all have used. So thank you. Now, our next question is, what are some of the biggest problems that hinder prosperity from happening in emerging economies? So this resilience we talk about, this health and wealth and well-being and abundance, thriving, what are some of the biggest problems? And then here you can use it could be a word, a phrase, whatever you think. Social inequality, market-creating innovations, access to opportunity, so education, working capital. Those are all major problems, right? In fact, the World Bank last week, I think, released a study that talked about how 2/3 of governments in low-income countries, low middle-income countries, have reduced their education budgets, right, as a result of COVID, in comparison to 1/3 in higher income countries. On the surface, it's like, well, that's not too bad, but the average high-income country spends about $8,500 a year per student, and the average low-income country spends roughly $48. So just let that sink in a little bit. $8,500, $48, and 2/3 of the $48 crew have reduced their education budget. So corruption, poor governance, gender inequality, those are all major problems that hinder prosperity from thriving. Now let's take a look at you've been elected president, you've been elected senator, you've been elected prime minister, whatever the top position is, governor, whatever. What solutions? So now we've recognized some problems, right? These are some major problems. What solutions come to mind, right? What would you do? Or, you're the CEO of a big firm or whatever. What solutions would you recommend in order to tackle some of these problems? If the problems are, corruption, inequality, social inequality, education, access to education. Okay, so we've got grassroots movement, education for women and equal pay for all. Okay, an enabling environment. Okay, so enabling environment and answering the question, why are African women and answering the question why African women are still poor. Got you, despite being the most hardworking. So really digging into that question, right? Why is that the case? Let's get a couple of more recommendations for solutions. What comes to mind as something you would say, let's do circular economy models, right, across industries. So you have this circular economy where you're not, there's not a lot of waste, right? There's no waste. You try to use a lot of what you consume and little waste there. Freer flow of capital and access to financing on micro and macro on a macro level. Okay, thank you all for that. Now, I think one of the things that I want to share today, and perhaps why I started us here, was really to ground us to ground us so that we begin to understand and appreciate the role of innovation in helping countries prosper. Now, it's important for the government to act in many of these countries, but when we look at the circumstances many governments find themselves, we begin to see how difficult it is. This doesn't get them off the hook, but it helps us appreciate how incredibly difficult it is without the private sector, or at least innovation-focused private sector, lending a helping hand. So let's actually do one more before I sort of dive in. And so let's get some responses. How much did the Nigerian government spend per citizen in 2020? This is on everything, right? On education, healthcare, infrastructure, defense, law enforcement, existing salaries, transportation, building institutions, foreign policy, maintaining, managing its embassies. Roughly how much would you say the Nigerian government spent per citizen per year? If you were to pick A, B, C, D, or E. Okay, $5,000. E, not bad. A, wow. Mary, that's okay. A, you've got E and A. C, 1,500. B, 1,000. A, okay. So we've got sort of A, B, B, D, C, A. Okay, excellent. So right answer is A, $200. And of this $200, about $50 to $75 went to debt holders. So, every country borrows, right? So, every country pretty much has debt. Of the $200, the federal government in Nigeria has to spend on everything. About 50 to 70 or so went to just pay off interest on its debt. So it's left with about $130. Now, compare that with the United States, where the country spends roughly $20,000 per person at the federal government level. Or Norway, Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, where they're spending upwards of $30,000. In Latin America, they spend on the lower end a couple thousand, $1,000, a couple $1,000. So when you look at this number, it doesn't tell the whole story, but it begins to help us appreciate that. I don't care how good you are with money. The Nigerian government will never be able to provide free education that is meaningful, at least, healthcare that any of us would want to go get healthcare in, security. As I speak to you today, if you've read the Wall Street Journal, you know that there's been a spate of kidnappings in Nigeria, and it's as if the kidnappers just do whatever they want to do. They go into a school, grab a couple hundred kids. Whenever the next time you read a rankings report, ease of doing business, corruption perception index, remember this number. Remember that those reports don't tell the whole story, because it is impossible for a government at this level, right, spending this little, especially a government with the kinds of inefficiencies, right, that are apparent in low-income country governments to be able to provide the kinds of solid, stable institutions, the infrastructure, and the setup that the country needs. It doesn't excuse them, but it helps, again, reinforce the importance of innovation in the private sector that can hopefully help increase taxes. And over time, we get this symbiotic relationship that now exists in many wealthier countries. So here's what we'll talk about today. The prosperity paradox, what is it? The importance of sound theory, the benefits and limits of data, and what the solution to the prosperity paradox is. So I'll tell a quick story just to really ground us in the prosperity paradox. Now, this happened to me in 2008. For the first time since I came to the US in 2000, I went back to Nigeria. I took this picture side of a riverbank, women washing their clothes. So I think it was Kelly who said, why do African women work the hardest, they get paid the least? Well, I saw that firsthand. And so when I saw this, the community where these women lived was about a mile, maybe a couple miles away. So I thought to myself, let's make life easy. Let's build a well. So built a well, this is the community, is smack dab middle of the community. At the time, I had a job as an engineer in Wisconsin, and life was good. So I built the well, I'd done my good deed, I came back to America. A few months later, I get a call, the well's broke. Well, what are we gonna do? I figured out a way to get somebody to go out there, fix the well. A couple months after that, the well broke again. I realized this this method, whatever I was doing, was not sustainable and wasn't quite working. And so after building 5 wells in different communities, the organization, some friends and I stopped building wells. As far as we were concerned, that strategy just wasn't working, and I just couldn't keep raising funds for this nonprofit, telling people we're building wells, taking pictures like this, and then the well breaks in a few months. Very few organizations send pictures of broken wells to the funders saying, hey, the well we built is broken. But many of us send pictures like this. But here's the thing. If that were just me, I would be like, okay, it's just me. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do this. I later found out there are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of wells in many emerging, this report was in African countries that were broken. They were just lying, just broken right there. They weren't being used. But that picture right there gives you, it serves as a microcosm of the larger industry, the larger development industry. See, poverty almost always shows itself as a lack of resources. A lack of water, education, infrastructure, healthcare, whatever, right? It's a lack. And to fix it, what do? We go in, we see the lack, and we say, let me try to fix this. And that's certainly what I did, certainly what many organizations do. And I would argue it's the dominant strategy. If you were to boil down, fairly simplistically, the strategy of the development sector, this is it, right? To the point now where we go into communities, people don't have money, and we do cash transfers. We say, let's give you $50 a month for 18 months, and let's study you. Let's see what happens. Does that benefit you? Most reports find out it does benefit people, which is surprise, surprise, right? Imagine if the company you're working for stopped paying you. It'd be hard for you to make rent and pay for your kids' college and so on. But I think the focus on providing the resources without understanding or appreciating the mechanism that keeps these resources sustained is the biggest issue. And we'll talk about that mechanism today. And then this is what it looks like, right? If you, there was a book by Lan Pritchett and a couple of other, he's a development economist, and a couple of other development professionals who studied more than 60,000 people in a bunch of different countries and asked them, look, how did you escape poverty? And the vast majority of them said economic transformation, new job, new business, they got a raise, they sold property, just something like that, that increased their income. And then all other factors were in the 29%, right? Some were like, I won the lottery and things like that. Anti-poverty programs were actually just as good as like winning the lottery. But when we now look at development funding, what goes to economic infrastructure, this is sort of what we see. This is the mismatch that we see. And this is a big problem. It doesn't mean conventional projects don't have impact, not the point. The key is just like the well we built, right? It's hard pressed to say that the well had an impact. For the 6 months it provided water, and subsequent months after that, it had some kind of impact. It provided 1 or 2 jobs for the time it was being built, but it was not sustainable and it broke. And I think this is why many emerging economies cannot climb the ladder to achieve the prosperity that many of you defined, right? Thriving, success, wealth, and well-being. This is now what you get as a result of the dominant strategy. For our book, we shared this slide, some research on per capita income for some countries in the 1960s versus 2015. And these countries actually have a lower per capita income adjusted for inflation. This is why I think Clay grounded his work on sound theories. He felt the way you make progress in life is building and using sound theories. But the question is, how do we build this? How do we build sound theories? Let me give you a quick example. The first thing you do is sort of you question something, or you observe something, you want to understand something. And so you sort of ask a question. In the case that we'll talk about now, it's the question is, what causes flight, right? And then if you want to understand what causes flight, what's the best thing to do? You observe things that fly and you record them. And then after you record them, you can decide how long you want to record, but you get a bunch of data and you say, let me start to create some connections and correlations. Well, early researchers said, look, the R squared, you run a regression, things that fly and winged feathers, the R squared was through the roof. So we believe that winged feathers cause flight. So a lot of guys, no joke, strapped winged feathers on their backs, jumped off of buildings, and you can guess what happened to them, right? They crashed. It wasn't until Bernoulli helped us understand the concept of lift that we were able to now get a much better sense for what caused flight. See, winged feathers were highly correlated with flight. But the causal mechanism, the thing that caused flight, made it predictable, made it easy for us to get on a plane today, was the theory of lift, understanding how air and pressure would flow through a wing and create this lift, right? And so once we understood that, we could more predictably fly. Now, in development, there are many things that are correlated with prosperity. Education, healthcare, good institutions and infrastructure. You go to most cities in the world, they pretty much look the same. Most cities, right? Roads, skyscrapers, flowing water and so on. And so there is a tendency for us to say these things, this is what causes prosperity. It's education, it's healthcare, it's infrastructure, and so on. Well, these things are all correlated, but they are not the causal mechanism. And so understanding what a theory is and how it can help us is absolutely critical to doing our work. So what is a theory? Simply put, it's a statement of what causes what and why, right? And so I think theories are often misunderstood to be connected to, the hard sciences, like, oh, I don't use theories in my life, but I think we all wake up and use theories. We all, it's really simply a statement of what causes something and why it causes it. And so when I make an investment, when the organization I founded, right, when we built that well, the theory we were acting on was, if we build this well, it will cause this community to have free flowing water. That was what we believed. It was a faulty theory. It was incomplete, but that was what we believed. And so we all use theories. The question is, how good are the theories we use, right? The second thing about theories is they are circumstance specific, right? Now, when you take averages and you sort of lump everything together under an average, you look at 100 countries and you say, these ones have spent this much on education, these ones don't. And the ones that spend this much on education, you can sort of recognize some patterns there. And then you make a conclusion that, oh, these countries just need to spend as much in education and they'll get some of the benefits of these countries. We really miss the point. We miss something really, really big. Theories are circumstance specific. And so what this ultimately means is the solutions to help organizations, innovators, and countries are going to be circumstance specific as well. They will depend on where the country, where the region finds itself. They're characterized by if-then statements. And this is really hard when you do averages, right? Because you sort of do broad strokes. But a good theory says, look, if you find yourself in this situation, here's what you do. And sound theories can help us predict the future, and they go much farther than data. I'll give you a quick example to illustrate this. In the 1980s, late 1980s, AT&T consulted a big consulting firm, McKinsey, and said, hey, we are thinking about investing in mobile phones. Help us do a quick analysis. Roughly how many phones do you think will be in the world in the year 2000? Turn of the century. McKinsey, big consulting firm, the most prestigious, AT&T, global telco, smartest guys in that industry, did the analysis, looked at the data, and said about 900,000. The year 2000, it'd be roughly 900,000 phones. Now, we might laugh and say, oh, how'd they miss it? But let's go back to the 1980s. Mobile phones were not what we see today. They were big, bulky, heavy, expensive. There wasn't any need for them, really, when you think about how we used to live back in the day. There wasn't, like, the idea of someone walking around with the phone didn't make a lot of sense. And like many new technologies, they depended on network effect, right? The value of a mobile phone is that other people have it and I could easily reach them. And so because there weren't that many, it's like, why would anybody buy these expensive things that only business people at the biggest corporations use? All the data pointed to no opportunity. In the year 2001, there were over 1 billion phones in the world. Now, why did the most prestigious consulting firm in the world and this big company miss this opportunity? Well, they did because they looked precisely at the data and they predicted the future based on the data they were seeing. If they leveraged circumstance-based theory, my guess is they might have been able to make a much better decision. And so one of the things they could have looked at was the evolution of technology over time. If you look at most technologies, you find they often start out big, bulky, expensive, And over time, they get a little less expensive and more affordable and more accessible. You look at refrigeration, you look at electricity, you look at the television, which was widespread at the time. You look at computing, which was starting to sort of garner in the 1980s. You had the emergence of Apple, Microsoft, personal computers. Now, they didn't know what the phone would look like, but they could have used the theory to say, look, if this sector evolves similar to others, we can predict that there will probably be this many phones. It would give people the opportunity to do this, to do that, to make calls, be more productive, and so on. But they used the data, and I think that is one of the biggest struggles in the sector where many of us are passionate about. And so, how does this affect how we now think about prosperity? Right now, this is why prosperity struggles to take root. One of the first things is we ask ourselves the question, how can we end global poverty? And then what do? We gather data from countries that have, and what kind of poor countries that lack. And what do we see, right? We see a lot of education, governance, institutions, infrastructure, healthcare, that those are correlated. And then we say providing, depending on what your dissertation's in, depending on what you study, what you're passionate about, providing this will end poverty. But poverty still persists. Big problem. Two main problems with that. The first is we are not even really trying to create prosperity. Remember how you all defined prosperity in the beginning? Ending poverty is not the same as that, right? So we're not even tackling the problem. And the second is, like winged feathers, right? We are really confusing correlation and causation. Many of the things we see correlated with prosperity are consequences and outputs of prosperity. They are not the causes of prosperity. Especially when you look at the circumstance in which many poor countries find themselves at $200 per person per year. There is no way a poor country can invest in education, governance, institutions, healthcare, it's just not possible. Especially when you add on to that the culture of corruption, mismanagement. That's just not how the world works. I think it's how we want the world to work, but that's just not how it works. Now let's get some more audience participation. I've been talking too long. I'm going to show you some data here. As I put it, I'd love for you to actually just start giving me ideas of what country this might be, right? It's a country doesn't have a lot of access to electricity. Infant mortality is sky high. A couple of kids die before their 5th birthdays. So if you're starting to get ideas of countries, just start putting them down. Rural population, right, is quite high. Secondary school is not very much attended, very few people. Household income on food, right, more than 50%. Life expectancy is low, incredibly low. So I'd be close to my twilight years now if I were living in this country. So let's see. Let me. What countries come to mind? You don't have to, be technical about it. But what do you think this country is? Malawi. That's a good one. Thank you, Austin. Thank you. So Malawi. Let me get a few more. There are 36 of you. So unless some of you are sleeping. Congo, Somalia, DRC, CAR. Those are very good ones. So Somalia, DRC, CAR, Congo, really whichever of the Congos. Somalia, that's another good one. Let me get one more, and then we can move on. Gambia, excellent. Yaya Jammeh is Gambia. So those are all excellent. I love how virtually all of them, all the countries were African based. Sometimes I do get some Afghanistan. right? Which is another good guess. Well, this country, these demographics I got from the United States. Whenever I say this, especially when I'm in front of people, it's like, oh my gosh, this guy is crazy. He must be smoking something. Well, not really, right? Not the United States of today, obviously. You go back 100 to 150 years, this was the United States. In addition to this, there was widespread corruption and nepotism in the US government. Back then, infrastructure was not as it is today. And whenever you had an infrastructure project, it's a book called The Big Roads that just talks about how the US got its infrastructure, at least the road infrastructure. And it explained how you would get a dime worth of roads for every dollar you spent. Bridges were constructed so shoddily that they would actually crumble. It wasn't it was something that happened, once every blue moon, right? Now, no two countries are identical. No, obviously times have changed and are different, right? But the reason I illustrate this is to ask the question: if we're serious about prosperity, how did America go from here to where it is today? Did it fix its education problem, fix its institutions, fix its infrastructure, fix corruption, or was it more an evolutionary process that happened over time, funded largely by innovations that made products cheaper, so that more people could afford them? Well, if you're in this session, you probably know what I think the answer is and what history shows the answer is. It was this evolutionary process where companies like Singer, Bank of America, Ford decided to make products simple and affordable, so millions of Americans could afford them. And this has a really interesting effect on the economy. So we'll talk about Singer for a second. Here's a guy. He didn't really go to school, but he was brilliant. Wanted to be an actor, actually, a thespian. Uh, and he had a knack for just, tinkering and working on stuff. Uh, he he developed a Singer sewing machine. He didn't invent the sewing machine, but he made it a lot more efficient. And he went from, you go from 10 hours to sew a shirt to an hour. But that wasn't the main innovation, right? It wasn't technical per se, just technical. He developed a business model that made it possible for the average household to be able to purchase a sewing machine. And so all of a sudden you had Singer building factories employing thousands of people, making tens of thousands of sewing machines a week just to get out to his customers. And then you had these newly indoctrinated immigrants into the US coming in, being able to afford a sewing machine. They learn how to use it and they start making clothing. And then from there, you have innovations in different business models, right? So Singer said, look, the average family cannot afford $100 it would cost for my sewing machine. So let me figure out how to make it more affordable. So his company provided financing. As companies bought this sewing machine, people who were skilled in design said, look, I can design the patterns and you can sew and I'll create a small business. And then it's like, oh, well, where do we sell this if a lot of people want this? And you got department stores opening up, selling these clothing, and you get sort of the standardization of clothing. Oh, and by the way, you need a lot more textiles, raw materials. You need a lot more steel, wood for the Singer sewing machine. And then you see the birth of these industries. Singer never set out to create any major industry. He's wanted to sell sewing machines, but you sort of see the knock-on effect. And this is the one thing that often gets lost. And I'll ask a question. How do you have a Department of Labor without labor, or perhaps without organized labor? When you had companies like Singer's hiring tens of thousands of people. People saw that they weren't treated right. So it wasn't like Singer set out to treat people right. But people said, look, we're working 12 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week. We don't want this. They now had the ability to organize, right? And so in some ways, it's incredibly difficult for you to get the benefits of organized labor without labor. Um, Now, history doesn't tell the story with innovation at the core because it's very difficult. It happens in a dynamic way. What history says is, in 1903, the United States decided to set up the FDA. And once the United States did that, we saw improvement in the ability to get good drugs out there, food and safety, and so on. How did the United States emerge to the point where it felt it needed an FDA? That is an innovation story that often does not get told. Bank of America is the logo in the middle, started out as a bank of immigrants. And Amadeo Giannini decided to focus on hardworking immigrants who were just coming into the United States. It at one point became the largest bank in the country. It's the second largest now, I believe. Henry Ford, we all know his story. As imperfect as the man might have been, he democratized access to the car. And when Ford decided to pay his employees $5 a day and go from 6 days a week to 5, the Wall Street Journal said it was sacrilegious, that this is going to impact the business world, this is going to kill it. But Ford saw efficiency improvements. He was spending so much money on employee turnover, because they were working in inhumane circumstances, right? Anyways, the point is, innovation fueled the development of the United States. And now we enjoy a lot of things. We have become the richest country in the world, but without a focus on innovation, it would have been difficult for the United States to get to where it is today. So the question now becomes, how do we define innovation? I was going to do some participation, but I'm looking at the time. I'd love for us to have some questions. Simply, it's a change in the process by which inputs of lower value become outputs of higher value. That's it, right? You've got inputs of lower value, capital, equipment, people, labor. How do we combine all that together so that it can give us outputs of higher value? Now, thinking about it that way, and then looking at the economy, there are 3 types of innovations. Yeah. Broadly speaking, the first type are what we call sustaining innovations. These are innovations that make products better. And so think about your iPhone, right? You've got a new iPhone 12, 13, new camera. It's gonna, new processor. It's faster, bigger memory. These are innovations that are improve the existing products. And they expand the wealth networks, right? They target existing consumers, right? If you couldn't buy an iPhone 10 and there's an iPhone 11, it's hard for me to believe you would be able to buy an iPhone 11 if you couldn't buy 10, if you didn't get like a new job or, won the lottery or something. So they're targeted at existing consumers. They want better features for them. From a development standpoint, typically it's neutral. It doesn't really have a huge bang. Largely because, think about it, right? Apple does not build a bunch of new stores just to sell you and I a new iPhone. It doesn't build a bunch of new manufacturing plants. It repurposes what it has. It sends the products to the existing stores and they just change inventory. So it does have some impact, but it's not as much. The second type are what we call efficiency innovations. Efficiency innovations are innovations that enable a company to do more with less. The key here, though, is the products that the company creates are being sold to the existing customers. And so this is a cost-cutting measure, right? This is when a company says, I'm gonna outsource jobs from this region to another region. I'm gonna leverage some automation so I don't have to hire as many people, or I can let some people go. This ultimately results in negative development. If you don't believe me, drive through the Rust Belt in the United States, or visit a community that had a couple of manufacturing plants, and then those jobs were shipped elsewhere. Now we have to look at innovation from the standpoint not of the global economy and how it's become a lot more competitive and efficient, but from the standpoint of the economy where the innovation is being practiced. And that's really what we're talking about today, right? Because we can come up with a bunch of different formulas and say, oh, but efficiency makes increases productivity, and then that reduces price, and that is better for the whole economy. Well, tell that to the people who lost their jobs in the Rust Belt of the United States, right? Because in economics, labor is often a variable, but in real life, labor is a father, is a mother, is a daughter. Labor is a person. And so, yeah, the world has gotten more efficient, but the key is, how has that innovation impacted that economy? Notice I haven't used the word good or bad. Sustaining innovations, efficiency innovations, they are what they are. I'm not going to say one innovation is better than the other, but as we think about the kinds of innovation activity we want to deploy our capital to, I think it's important that we appreciate the impact it has on the economy. And I think that's the purpose of this categorization scheme. It's not to say, do this, don't do that. It's really to help us see a little clearer the impact of a certain type of innovation. The last type of innovation I'll talk about here are market-creating innovations. These are innovations that make products simple and affordable so many, many, many more people can afford them. These products target what we call non-consumers, people who historically could not afford a product or a service, but because you've created a new product or a new business model that targets them, they're now able to afford it. Now, at the core of market creating innovations are jobs. They're jobs because now I need to hire many more people to make the product, market the product, service the product, sell the product, and so on and so forth, right? In addition to that, because I'm creating a new market, what I ultimately am doing is enabling development. First of all, I got more people with jobs, so I got more people who are paying income taxes. Now I got more taxes, corporate tax, income tax, and those taxes are going to fund institutions, infrastructure, and other things that make society prosperous. Remember how we started this, right? And the last thing, which is often difficult to quantify, is these innovations begin to create a culture that values entrepreneurship, innovation, enterprise. And so I give you a quick example, right? When you think about a new product, it could even be the iPhone. Before the iPhone, how many smartphone companies were out there making smartphones and thriving? How many people were making apps for these smartphones? You create an entirely new ecosystem that has the foundation of a culture that believes in this new market, in this new ecosystem that's been created. And then other suppliers and developers now come on top of it, and they begin to make a living. This was the mechanism that was missing when I went into a community and just built a well. There was no mechanism to help sustain that resource. So what are the implications for business? Yeah, because okay, Efosa, if you say these innovations are interesting, they're good, they have this impact, well, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, first of all, um, we've talked about some of it, but in the sense that we're not even really trying to create prosperity, right? Where a lot of times we're just like me, we're trying to just go and build a well and go out, literally or metaphorically speaking. But the second is, look, they are more risky. They're typically sustaining innovations. A market already exists. And so it doesn't take that much for you to say, look, I think people want a better camera. Let's put a better camera on the phone. I mean, you might disagree on what features to put on the camera, but for the most part, that's an argument that may not get you fired. Sustaining innovations typically align with existing processes. There's a book called The Resource Allocation Process by a Harvard Business School professor, Joseph Bauer. I'd recommend if you want to learn more about how organizations allocate their resources to go after sustaining type innovations and efficiency innovations. Efficiency innovations might actually get you a raise. Imagine going to your manager and saying, hey, we've been doing this way for 3 years. I think we can do it more efficiently. It'll save us 15%. And we might even be able to get rid of a few people you don't like working with. Hopefully you're not one of those people that the manager will fire. But anyways, so efficiency innovations might actually get you a raise. Again, the market exists. You're just trying to make things more efficient. It's not as much of a risk. Typically, the investments are less. And then market creating innovations, though, what you're asking for is, hey guys, there's this new market I think we can create. It's a bunch of people who we've never sold to. We don't even know who they are. We're gonna have to understand them, who they are, study them, what they like, figure out how to introduce this product, test it. Oh, by the way, they don't have a ton of money, because people who have a ton of money, we're all already trying to get their disposable income. So let's go for it. You can see why market creating innovations are going to be difficult to convince people of and to invest in. I will not sit here and say, oh, market creating innovations are easy, just do it. But part of why we've built this boot camp is to help innovators and entrepreneurs go through a series of theories. Remember the theories we talked about earlier that help make the decisions a little easier. So if you're going to create a new market in a particular field, there are certain innovation theories that tell you, if you find yourself in this circumstance, here are the things you need to do. You can quibble and sort of like, oh, but if I were in Norway, I wouldn't have to invest in my own electricity. I wouldn't have to spend this much on educating my workforce. But you're not in Norway, you're in Niger, right? And when you look at Norway, when it had demographics like Niger, companies that cared about scaling had to make these types of investments, right? And so the point of this boot camp is really to help innovators make the decision to the innovation decisions a little easier. Market creating innovations are not easy by any stretch of the imagination, because you are really creating an entire ecosystem. But when you know or have some confidence in the decisions you're making as an organization, I think they can make those things a lot easier. So let's look at what I mean and why they're so impactful. So, today we take the automobile as a foregone conclusion. Of course, there are cars, there are roads. But when Ford was trying to democratize access, that was not the case. There was not the infrastructure. There was not the gas stations and service stations. And so Ford had to build what I call the business infrastructure. And so if you look at steel mills and glass factories, gas stations, he had to build all this. Now today, if you were an investor in Ford and Ford in the quarterly call said, "Hey, we want to go into the gas station business, or we want to build some glass factories," you might pull your money out. But at the time, to create this new market, the executives realized this is what we need to do, because we need a steady and predictable supply of these components if we're going to be able to affordably get a car to the average American. And then we now look at the societal impact, right? Not only with tens of thousands of jobs created at Ford, but hundreds of thousands of jobs were created in a bunch of other sectors. There was a road building boom that emerged as a result of the automobile. And how does America fund its roads today? So many of you probably know it's through taxes. What kind of taxes? Gas taxes and tire taxes. Rubber tire in your car. So now, just this simple analysis, you go to a country like Nigeria, where the diffusion of cars is sub 9%, right? There's no way that country is ever building roads. Again, this is simple math, right? The United States tried to build roads in the early 1800s. The federal government passed the buck down to the states. It was hard. They couldn't quite do it. You get the car, and all of a sudden you have a big road building boom. In fact, now that we're building more fuel efficient cars and, we don't pay as much in gas taxes, we have this huge infrastructure deficit, right? And so I'm not saying, we should build less fuel efficient cars, but I'm just saying there is an effect. We will need to figure out how to, especially as we're transitioning to electric cars, we will need to figure out how to maintain our infrastructure, because it's right now connected to gas taxes and tire taxes. So we might have to do miles driven or something like that. But the minute you see the relationship between innovations and infrastructure and institutions, you begin to see the precarious situation many poor countries find themselves, and how they will never, I rarely use those words, but when it's math, right, 2 + 2 can never be 5, it's 4. But it's going to be hard for these countries to build their infrastructure without this engine of innovation that can fund it. Yeah. This is possible in Africa. And I've got maybe just 1 or 2 more slides, and then we can open up for questions. It is possible in Africa. Not easy, but it's possible. Proliferation of mobile phones is possible in other emerging economies as well. I like this example, and I use it a lot because it is the example that everybody can agree on. It's the example that has taken the world by storm. It's the example that has worked in almost every economy. Right. And so there are some examples that have worked exceedingly well in India, some in Nigeria, some in Kenya. You talk about mobile money, for instance. Well, people say, well, the Kenyan regulators, that was the reason it worked. And perhaps they might be right. This example has worked in virtually every economy. The ones that are lowest on corruption perception index, the ones that are middle of the road. And I think it provides for us a lesson. It provides a lesson that, maybe it is possible to democratize an innovation, develop a business model that makes it possible for people who historically have not had access to be able to access. And by the way, if we do that, we're going to be able to reap significant returns for the companies, create a ton of jobs, provide tax revenue, and begin to create a culture that values innovation. I'll go with some takeaways. Now, there are no easy answers to development. There are no easy answers to innovation, especially in emerging economies. But I strongly and firmly believe that if we if we have this paradigm shift, right? The one that I went through, quite frankly, no matter how many wells my organization built, if we kept building wells, literally and metaphorically speaking, um, holding on to the impact those wells are having, and even if we became more efficient at building wells, you now know that we were playing in the correlation space. What we need to figure out is how can we develop innovations that empower people, make products simple and affordable, create jobs, create taxes, so that when we leave, these economies can stand on their own. And to connect it to where we are today, they wouldn't have to be begging for vaccines and to be shipped from all over the world and not have the infrastructure to manage them and so on. And I'm tired of that. And I hope many of you are too. We've been to the moon. We've launched satellites. We can solve this problem, but we can't solve it if we're not trying to solve it. That's a sort of simple logic. So just a few takeaways. A theory is really a statement of causality, right? So think about the theories that you use on a daily basis, whether it's in your personal life or your organization, and think about that, how that influences your decision making. Sound theories are circumstance specific, characterized by if-then statements. There are a few universal theories, right, that are just true all the time, no matter the circumstance you find yourself. When we fix the visible signs of poverty, that's not the same as creating a sustainable path out of poverty, creating prosperity. It's not the same. The outcomes we want to achieve. So, talked about, when I went into the community, what I wanted to achieve was water. I want this community to have access to water. That's not the same as the solution to get the community water in a sustainable way. Outcomes and solutions are vastly different. And oftentimes we confuse the two of them. The prosperity paradox persists because the predominant theory of development is incomplete. It's not wrong. We just believe it's incomplete. It's missing this critical element, this innovation piece that can help us with sustainability, that can help us pull in a lot of the other things that are correlated with development and prosperity. Market-creating innovations, critical missing piece. So the boot camp is really going to help us. We're going to introduce, innovation theories and frameworks in the subsequent sessions, right? Talk about non-consumption, talk about the job to be done theory, forces of progress. Why do people make the decisions they make? Value networks and modularity theory. So this is sort of some of the innovation theories and frameworks packed into the boot camp. Obviously, couldn't go over all of them today, but hopefully this has been somewhat enlightening, maybe slightly interesting, and hopefully not a complete waste of your, let's say, 70 or so minutes. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you today. I can take questions if there are any. Sorry. Yeah, so I see a question signing up. So we actually have a Q&A that we'll be doing about the boot camp on March 25th, I believe. There is a link my Twitter. That's the link right there. Yes. Thank you, Courtney. And so We are starting out in 7 countries. Because of the pandemic, it's going to be virtual, I think, for most of them. We delivered a virtual one last week, and it went quite well, actually. Um, and so I think we've sort of figured out how to do this over the virtual world. It's going to start in Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Senegal, Uganda, Rwanda. We'll do this. Then I'm in these 7 countries. So, um, yeah. So, advice for young entrepreneurs. So that's a tough one, and that's partly why we are building this. So forgive me and forgive me. I wish I were better at Excel. Um, Let me see. Okay, let me go to this slide. That question is why we are building the boot camp infrastructure. Um, so the advice would be, yeah, sorry, this is so unprofessional. All right, there we go. Um, I mean, it requires an ecosystem. Market creating innovation. In the market creating innovation session, we talk about how it's not just a product or a service; it's a system. Um, and so, as much as you can connect yourself to a community of like-minded people who think similarly, who believe in the same things, that is incredibly important. That's critical. Because of the emergence of technology these days, it's a lot easier to do that. But I recognize it's not all the way easy. That's one. So try to connect yourself with a community of like-minded people. It's what we're trying to do with this. The second thing is a lot of times we want to solve the world's problems tomorrow. And perhaps a way I could describe that is think of it, use it like, let me use an analogy. If you wanted to go on a 1,000 mile or 1,000 kilometer drive, you wouldn't instantly think, I will get there in an hour or 2 hours. You would plan that drive. You would look at, okay, how, do I have, can I buy a plane ticket? Do I have money for that? Okay, do I take a bus? Do I have a car? Do I drive my car? If I do, can I get enough gas to put in my car? Do I have some snacks, some food to eat on the way, and so on, right? So the first thing is, look at the problem you want to solve and assess your capabilities, your resources, right, which are made up of, your capital or access to capital, access to a community of people that can help you, coaching, mentoring, and so on. Um, so you assess your resources, technology, access to technology, your own brain power. That's a resource, right? How brilliant are you? For example, I mean, I'm not a coder, so I know I will need a coder if my solution required coding. I'm not a manufacturing expert. If my solution required that, I would need that, right? So you assess that, first of all. And then the second thing you want to assess are your processes. What processes do you need to put in place so that you can more efficiently use the resources that you now have access to, or you will have access to, or you will need? And so you start with your resources, you assess your processes, and then the last is your profit formula. And what that is essentially you're getting into how big are the opportunities I need to go after? How much can I sell this product so that I can make a healthy return and create a sustainable business? How much are my customers going to be willing to pay? What's the profit formula that's going to drive this new organization I'm setting up? I think once you can assess those things, we, sort of put all those things together and call them our capabilities. Once you can assess your capabilities, you begin to get a sense for what this journey you're about to go on will take. And so it doesn't help you get there tomorrow, but it begins to help you appreciate even what you're trying to do. Thank you, Rosemary, for the question. I think to answer the first question, which is how do you bring this mindset shift in the development world where impact is often measured in social benefits? You know, um, I will sound like a broken record, and I apologize. Uh, but broken records aren't bad. um, the diffusion of any technology or an idea takes a while. And one of the things that is common when you want to diffuse a new idea, when you want to shift a paradigm, is communication. We have to over communicate. 300 years ago, if you were an innovator, you were laughed at. Innovators were people who were not part of the aristocracy, right? You had to work, you had to use your brain in some sense. Today, that's a different story, right? Innovators are celebrated. How and why? Well, we communicate the impact of innovators, we communicate an idea. So we have to almost over communicate this new paradigm. That's one, right? There are going to be some early adopters, but many people, unfortunately, are laggards if you look at the way ideas diffuse in an economy. Um, so that's one. The second thing is, um, what do we now communicate? You see, behind every foundation of any kind of relevance is a thriving, profitable business. It's that simple. Gates Foundation, well, there's no Gates Foundation without Microsoft and Warren Buffett's Berkshire, by the way. There's no Rockefeller Foundation without Exxon, Standard Oil, Chevron, Standard Oil split. Ford Foundation, well, we've talked about Ford. Omidyar Network, that was eBay. Facebook, right? Chan Zuckerberg, no Chan Zuckerberg without Facebook. And so in communicating the importance of business and what many of these development organizations do in these foundations, in some ways, we got to remind them of how they are able to exist. And if the work they're doing is not about creating the kind of infrastructure and systems that can enable many emerging economies build their own Facebooks, metaphorically speaking, so that they don't need Chan Zuckerberg anymore, or as much as they do today, then unfortunately, we're just putting Band-Aids on a more serious problem, right? The work we have to do is build systems so that we don't need a development industry anymore. Some countries have grown out of aid, right? South Korea has, Singapore has, Taiwan for sure. So it is possible, but it requires this mindset shift. I believe it's possible for many of the world's poorest regions to become economically prosperous, because what is needed is people, ingenuity, and we have that in spades. So there does need to be an over communication of this idea, this paradigm. It doesn't mean they stop what they're doing, but they just need to do more of the other thing, innovation. Now, what is the role of governments? Well, it's hard to give you a universal answer, right? I just talked about circumstance-based theory, and I think it would be hypocritical for me to say governments must do this, must do that. And so the response is it depends. If you're in a country or a region, because sometimes countries are almost too too high level for us to do anything meaningful. If you're in a region, it could be a city or a state where the government is responsive to innovation activity, wants to push the needle, wants to learn, then it's in your best interest to work with the government, to figure out a way to inject yourself in there, influence them, help them see the value, not just you need to do this because that's your job, but see that, oh, if you do this, you'll help your people, but you'll also increase your own domain. Some of the biggest governments in the world are in the richest countries in the world, right? So the richer you get, the bigger you get as a government. And few people want to remain small. We all want to grow. We all want our sphere of influence to increase, right? So there is that, selling the idea of innovation-driven entrepreneurship to governments. Now, if you're in a sector or sorry, a region where the government pays you no time, then as an organization, you need to figure out how to engage the government proactively. Now, we have some research coming out in about a month, I think, maybe a month and a half, that showed market-creating innovators, especially in emerging economies, typically have to engage the government in some way if they want to be successful. And so the idea that things work in wealthier countries, they don't work in maybe emerging economies, and what's wrong with the government and so on. I think that's fair for a social media tweet and to get some people excited. But in terms of how real change happens, it's on us, actually, the innovators, to figure out how to incentivize the government to believe in what we're doing. And that's a hard question to answer, to provide a universal answer for, because it really just depends on who the government is. But having a strategy to manage the government relations is absolutely key. So, have a chief government officer, same way you have a chief financial officer, right? It's absolutely key. I've either done a wonderful job or a terrible job. Either way, I would like to thank all of you for listening and sticking around. I often say the two most important resources you could give people are your time and your money. Time, obviously, a lot more important because that's the only one you could never get back. And so I'm always deeply grateful and thankful whenever people, listen to me for any period of time. It really does mean a lot to me. So I want to thank you all for spending your time with me today. Deeply appreciate it. Thank you all.